All right, folks, welcome back to the From the Flight Deck podcast presented by Dial a Pilot. Kyle and Joey here, and today we're talking about what pretty much everybody's been asking us to talk about for a long time, and that's turbulence. So we're going to deep dive on that and the different types of turbulence, what the pilots are doing when we actually encounter it, how we can kind of expect to get around it, and all of those different things. So, Joey, how you doing, man?
I've been good, man. No change. It's fun to be back on video. Appreciate that. We've just been going through different servers trying to figure out what the best way forward is, and we're trying video again. So it's fun to be in front of you guys again.
Absolutely. No, I agree. It's fun to see you again, Joey. Good thing we got a couple days off here. I actually go out for my finish up stuff tomorrow. Head out to Washington D.C., so that's going to be pretty cool. But yeah, so turbulence. I mean, where should we even start? Should we go from the beginning of takeoff all the way to landing and kind of the different types of turbulence we run into? How does that sound to you?
Sounds good. Yeah. Usually, what I tell people, I mean, whenever we start turbulence or the talk about turbulence on the calls is first thing I say, the only thing I'm worried about in turbulence is if I'm going to spill coffee on my white shirt. That's like the most worried I am with turbulence is that fact right there, because our lids aren't great that we have at my airline. And so anytime bumps start rolling in, there's always a chance of coffee on the white shirt. So I always like to say that first for the individual to know that we're not scared about the airplane breaking up. We're not scared about falling out of the sky. We're not scared about the engines falling off. And we're going to talk about all these things specifically, but that's what I like to start, is that my biggest fear is the coffee.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with that entirely. I drink way too much coffee when I'm on the airplane. I don't know why. It's like this crux I have that I just can't get over. But our cups, yeah, I got the same thing going, man. I got the coffee cup here. Our cups on the airplane, they're kind of cool. They say flight deck use only on them. I remember when I got hired, one of the flight attendants handed me one of those cups, and I was like, yeah, baby, I made it. So that was kind of fun. But yeah, our lids aren't that great either. So, um, what Joey really means is when we get into that turbulence and, we're sitting there enjoying a cup of coffee, hanging out because of course the autopilot's on up at altitude and we're sitting there watching the airplane and monitoring everything. But the very first thing we do is kind of get that coffee cup away from our shirts, and make sure it doesn't spill on either us or the radios up in the airplane or anything like that. So turbulence is really a matter of simply being uncomfortable versus a matter of safety. And we're going to get into the safety side of things too, because there is some management of the cabin that goes on when we encounter turbulence. But from a structural integrity of the aircraft perspective, the safety and security of the flight is not in jeopardy. So, Joey, do you want to talk a little bit about the actual testing of the airplane? I remember seeing a video about the Airbus 350, which is Airbus's newest wide body, really cool airplane. And they actually bent the wings something like 21 feet in its testing phase before there any structural damage occurred, which is just so far beyond the normal flight envelope. I mean, these airplanes are engineered to these incredible limits. Do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a I don't know, engineer, I guess, if you will, but I've read things and I've seen videos as well. They'll literally take, it used to be just a harness, and they'll put it on the edge of the wing and they're going to stress test it until the point at which the wing will snap. And the engineers and the mathematicians will figure out the number there, the numerical value, and figure out how that translates to the loads that it's going to experience in a normal flight. And most of the time for our aircraft, it's anywhere from like 70% all the way to double the experience, the turbulence that you would ever experience in a normal flight. So the wings are able to handle double the turbulence that you could ever experience in a normal flight. I think that alone starts to make people more comfortable. And then the manufacturer also comes up with a turbulence penetration speed, and this might be getting a little bit in the weeds, but why I bring it up is you're flying along and you hit some clear air turbulence. So some turbulence, it's a beautiful day, your pilots aren't really expecting it. You hit the turbulence, and then in the back you're going to hear the engines wind down, and people have told me that they think, oh no, that means we're falling out of the sky. All your pilots are doing is slowing to the turbulence penetration speed. The turbulence penetration speed is more aerodynamic. I'm going to throw out some words here, but the aircraft, before any structural damage would happen to the aircraft would stall. We can talk about stalls if you want, Kyle. You can hit that if you want. But point being, nothing structurally is going to happen to the aircraft if we're at that speed. It's somewhat analogous to if you're driving on a highway going really fast and you see a pothole out ahead. And this isn't a perfect metaphor, but if you see a pothole out ahead, you're probably going to slow down. You don't want to hit that going full bore. Similar to airplanes, it's again more aerodynamic than structural, that speed. But again, the manufacturer came up with said speed for us. It's one of the memory items that we almost every pilot knows, and that's the speed we're going to try to go through the worst turbulence. But again, the wing structurally can handle up to 2 times more turbulence than you would ever experience on a normal flight, and that alone should make you comfort, give you comfort that the wings aren't going to fall off if you hit even severe turbulence.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And you mentioned stalls briefly, and the only thing I'm going to say about stalls is just to break the cycle of not quite understanding what a stall is, because I think I talk to a lot of people that say, "Oh, the engine stops working, the airplane stalls," and that's not the case. A stall is the actual airflow over the wing not being sufficient to provide lift. And a stall is recoverable. So we stall an airplane. You don't stall airliners. I mean, I don't even know when the last time an airliner stalled was outside of when they actually did the engineering and authorization, all that stuff. When they're building these airplanes, they go up and stall them and see how they handle, and they have to meet all these certain characteristics. But we don't stall airliners. When we go through pilot training in the smaller airplanes, we stall those things all the time, and it's very recoverable. You lower the nose and just pick up airspeed again, and boom, you're off to the races. But just so everybody understands, that's what a stall is when Joey says that. So from a once again, to summarize that whole part, from a structural integrity standpoint on the aircraft, the airplane is in good shape. Turbulence is not going to break the airplane apart. What we're really concerned about with turbulence from a pilot perspective and from a crew perspective, this brings the flight attendants into the mix too, is really the safety of passengers and crew from things flying around the cabin, other people, when people don't listen to the seatbelt sign, and all of a sudden, we hit severe turbulence, which also happens extremely rarely. I've only hit it once in my career, and it was going into Mammoth back in 2017. But when that happens, somebody's not in their seat and they fall over and they bonk heads with somebody on the aisle, or they fall forward and break a wrist or a collarbone or something like that. Those are the concerns that we have. And so that's why we have the seatbelt sign. And then as far as flight attendants go, you may hear us make announcements like, "Flight attendants, please take your jump seats. Flight attendants, be seated immediately." Things like those things. And that just means, hey, there's turbulence coming up and we need you to be in your seats. And it's strictly an abundance of caution approach. It's not, "Oh my gosh, hang on. Uh-oh." It's, "Hey, let's just have everybody be in their seats because we anticipate some bumps." And these airplanes handle it extremely well. But I just want to point that out, that is really the nature of kind of where we're coming from on these things. We don't want the flight attendants spilling hot coffee on themselves or on you. We don't want the carts, going all over the place, things like that. So that's, I think, the basics of, from a passenger standpoint, what you're experiencing on the airplane as far as turbulence goes. And we're going to get into the severity of turbulence, the different types of turbulence, and all those things. But from a basic understanding perspective, that's what I really want you to kind of hang on to is we're going to make decisions in the flight deck that are strictly out of an abundance of caution. And we're going to try and find a smooth ride, make it really comfortable, and just slow things down so that, we want you to be able to get up and go to the bathroom and go get coffee and do whatever you want. Cause you're sitting next to some individual in the middle seat and they're taking up both armrests, kind of hanging over into your side. We get it. That's not comfortable. Nobody wants to deal with that. So our goal is to find that smooth ride and to keep our white shirts nice and clean. Anything to add on that, Joey?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that this is mainly a passenger airlines topic, and why I bring that up is when I flew cargo for a year. I mean, we get annoyed by turbulence. I would say pilots get annoyed by turbulence, like it breaks up the otherwise smooth flight, and so it's more annoying to us. Again, not a safety thing, but annoying to us. So when I went to cargo coming from passengers, and then now I'm back with passengers. But in that middle, I did cargo. And when we flew cargo, we did not care as much as we care at the passenger airlines about turbulence. In fact, a lot of the times the worst turbulence usually gives you some of the best tailwinds, so we would sometimes just truck right through it and not worry about trying to avoid it as much. Obviously severe turbulence, we don't want to hit that, but any light turbulence or bumps or anything, we would just truck right through, because again, it's more an annoyance to us than we're worried about safety. We're not worried about the safety of the aircraft at all. So just as a little insight, I like to throw that out as well. That's We're only avoiding it for the comfort of you, the passenger. Otherwise, we'd probably just fly right through it, because then we don't got to change flight levels. We don't have to go 50 miles north. And that kind of leads me into this turbulence avoidance starts all the way back when the dispatcher, which if you listen to our last podcast, is planning the flight. Obviously, the airlines are a business, so they're going to try to make the route as efficient as possible. But if they can deliberately avoid an area of turbulence, they're going to do so, as long as efficiency obviously um, makes sense. So the dispatcher is already looking at all this stuff to try to figure out the best route with turbulence, and they have a lot of resources available to them. All, our aircraft and most aircraft out there will print out or send out turbulence plots. Like as an aircraft flies through turbulence, it's measuring it, and it will send it into some national database, which all gets put onto our iPads, and most of us can see that, where we can see aircraft out ahead or aircraft that flew earlier in the day and what kind of turbulence they're experiencing. All that stuff gets put on a map, and the dispatcher and us as pilots, we can see where the worst turbulence is going to be. And so the dispatcher will try their best to flight plan the flight to help us avoid turbulence. And then once we get in the air, there's a lot of different resources that we have. Air traffic control who is, I would say, the most up-to-date information, because again, like we said in the last podcast, they're controlling a small chunk of the sky, and every aircraft that goes through is going to give them turbulence reports, let them know if they're having a good ride, a bad ride. And almost every time you check on, if you're experiencing turbulence, they're going to ask, hey, what are the rides up above or down below? Are there any good rides? And the controller has, I mean, up to the second information on that. They can ask the aircraft ahead of you 50 miles what they're experiencing, or up 1,000 or down 1,000. And so it kind of turns into that once we get in the air, as well as our resources that we have. Again, we can see where bad turbulence is, where good turbulence is. But yeah, we rely a lot on air traffic control and other aircraft to try to find the best ride for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Those air traffic controllers are such a massive help for us in the flight deck in multiple ways, but turbulence certainly being one of them. So when we talk about turbulence, we classify it in multiple different ways, and the air traffic controllers are a big part of this. So instead of somebody saying, it's kind of bumpy, we actually have classifications for all these things. So we can check on and say, hey, we're getting light chop. What are you getting ahead? And they'll say, oh, moderate chop at flight level 350. And we go, okay, well, light chop is better than moderate, so we'll stay here. So to talk about what those classifications are, we go from anywhere, the lowest being light chop, and then we go to moderate chop, and then we go light turbulence, moderate turbulence, severe turbulence, extreme turbulence. I personally have never heard of extreme turbulence happening. There are bouts with severe turbulence occasionally. In fact, I saw a pilot report that was today over Denver. It was a Boeing 757 that reported severe turbulence at flight level 380, which is 38,000 feet. So those things do happen. They're definitely not common by any means. Like I said, in my, I guess, 9 years now of professional flying, I've only encountered it once. And it was honestly the kind of humorous part about the whole thing was we were flying a private jet from San Luis Obispo to Mammoth. I was in the right seat being the co-pilot, and the captain in the left seat were empty. We were going to pick up funny enough, a nervous traveler. And as we're descending in, we're coming kind of over the ridge, and all of a sudden you kind of see the speed start to rise on the airspeed indicator. And I was like, uh-oh, here it comes. And then boom, just getting beat up for like 5 seconds. And Captain and I are kind of laughing, and we're like, man, that was bumpy. And I turn around and look in the back of the airplane, and it was one of those airplanes that had a little like kind of a pull out toilet type thing. So it was, this little thing that probably had like 2 gallons of blue juice in it. and fortunately nobody had used it yet, but I looked back and there's blue juice all over the ceiling of the airplane, and I was like, I know as co-pilot, I'm the guy that has to go deal with that. So the worst part of severe turbulence was dealing with the blue juice after the fact that had gotten all over the airplane. Like I said, fortunately, no use of that blue juice as of that day. So that was my only encounter with severe turbulence. The airplane was fine. We were fine. Just kind of it was bumpy, and it was bumpy. But everything was fine. It kind of turned into a funny story, and I may have even used that in my airline interviews. I don't quite remember, but that was quite a memorable one for me. Have you ever run into severe turbulence, Joey? Have you ever run into severe turbulence, Joey?
Yeah, my first flight ever at when I at the regionals was operating experience, so IOE, initial operating experience with a Czech airman, and it was from San Francisco to Reno. And we'll get into designations and types of turbulence, but we hit like essentially mountain wave turbulence, which mountain wave turbulence is when winds come over the tops of mountains. They sometimes create eddies in the immediate vicinity, and then the propagation of the wind over the mountain creates turbulence up to into the 30,000 feet range. But we were experiencing this stuff immediately in the vicinity, the eddies that break over the mountains, and we hit one of those, and it was like really bad turbulence. This is my first jet flight ever, and it was really bad turbulence. And when we landed, the Czech airman was like, "Yeah, that was definitely severe turbulence." And whenever you experience severe turbulence, maintenance has to come out and do a walk around on the aircraft to make sure that everything is fine, which it almost always is, because like we talked about, these are stress tested to a ridiculous degree. But anyways, maintenance came out, they looked at the aircraft, everything was fine, and we continued on flying. But yeah, first flight ever on IOE, we hit severe turbulence, so that was exciting.
Wow, that is exciting. And if you're watching the video of this, I actually just drew this up
There you
on my
go.
little whiteboard over here so you can actually see what Joey's talking about. So those little blue arrows going through right there, that's what that wind would look like. And then it kind of tumbles going over the mountain. And then that wave at the top is actually, we actually can run into that with the airplane. And it'll have the airplane kind of increase speed, decrease speed. It changes its altitude a little bit, but going through those tumbly bits, that's where that severe turbulence can kind of happen. So, Joey, you are, of course, eloquent with your words, but I can draw on a whiteboard. So I wanted to include that for everybody that happens to be watching on the YouTube episode. But yeah, so that's crazy, man. Your first flight as an airline pilot and you hit severe turbulence.
Yeah, it was very exciting. Also, you look just like a weather guy for some reason with like the microphone and on the whiteboard. I thought you were like doing a little weather forecast. That was awesome. Nice work.
There you go, man. Yeah. Next on CBS News at 6. That's terrible. Anyways, so let's talk about the types of turbulence then. So we talked about the severity of turbulence, light chop all the way up to extreme turbulence. Now let's talk about the different types and the types that we would run into mostly on a flight that any of our clients would be on is what we call clear air turbulence, and that term tends to scare people a lot, and for good reason. There's some times where clear air turbulence can be pretty severe, and we can't see it, but there's also that's what we hit 95% of the time is that clear air turbulence, and that's simply where the winds come together. You got a jet stream coming from the north, and it kind of turns and makes its way out to the east. And where it turns there, just like an eddy in a river, or a bank in a river, it's going to interfere with the flow of that air, interfere with the flow of that water in the case of a river, and that creates a little bit of chop. So if you can imagine looking at a river, you see where it turns, and in that turn, you're going to see that little bit of bumpiness. Well, of course, we can't see it turn in the air because, well, that's kind of a obvious statement, but that would be clear air turbulence. So as we go through that, that's going to kind of feel like that light rhythmic chopping, a little bit of moderate chop maybe. But that's what people get nervous about because we can't see it. But again, that's what we hit 95% of the time. So clear air turbulence or shear turbulence is what that one's called. The fortunate thing about that is it's relatively easy to forecast because we have all of this amazingly thorough wind data, and that talks about the direction of the jet stream, where it turns, the speed of the jet stream. And so, as Joey talked about, when he was flying cargo with significant tailwinds, that makes you go faster. And we can have 200 miles an hour of wind up there, it's quite significant. And so that can reduce your flight time on a 15-hour flight by a few hours. I mean, it's pretty serious stuff. So it's nice to be able to get those tailwinds, but sometimes you have to do it at the expense of turbulence. And so in a commercial airline operation like ours, where we're carrying passengers, we're mostly going to go for those smoother rides, vice those tailwinds. Granted, having tailwinds does not mean turbulence. So I just want to point that out. Joey, anything to add on shear or clear air turbulence?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I do a lot of Atlantic flying, and the Atlantic is a hot spot, especially in the winter. So in the winter, the jet stream likes to go from being way up north over Canada and likes to come hug the United States, and then it kind of goes out more into the core of where we're flying over the Atlantic. And on the polar side of the jet stream is where you're also going to get a lot of turbulence, and why that is a lot of turbulence is, especially clear turbulence, is just change in direction and or speed of wind over a short distance, or and that can be a short distance horizontally or vertically. So as you're entering and exiting the jet stream, depending on your flight path or depending if you're trying to take advantage of tailwinds or try to get out of headwinds, as you're entering and exiting, you're probably going to get some turbulence. And again, on the northern side of that jet stream is where you get a lot of it. So I was just doing a call with somebody who was telling me that they had turbulence, and I was like, let me guess, it was like just as you were getting out over the water, because they were going over to Europe, and they're like, yes. And so again, if I can forecast it and guess where it is, so can the meteorologists that are extremely much smarter than me when it comes to this, and that's kind of what we're seeing. As far as each airline usually has their own meteorologist, and will try to determine where this is going to be on the jet stream. Then the other piece, again, just to make turbulence easy for you, is if you're walking outside on a really windy day and you're in like a big rain jacket that's grabbing the wind, if the wind is just steady state, it's just steady, you can kind of figure out how you need to walk and you can walk through it pretty easily. But as it gets really gusty and speeds up and slows down and speeds up and slows down, it becomes a lot harder to walk in that wind. And that's, again, very similar to what the aircraft is experiencing with this clear air turbulence. That is kind of what you're getting is, again, a change in the wind speed over horizontal or vertical distance of a short amount. If it's a small change over a long distance or a lot of altitude, you won't get as bad a turbulence. But I just like to throw that out there as an analogy or something to put your head into thinking about what the aircraft is experiencing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to throw out there. Those gusty winds, and we talk about gusty wind landings and crosswinds and all that stuff during training. And actually, it's pretty impressive in the simulators. They can simulate turbulence, and it feels extremely real. Like
Hmm.
really, it's quite impressive. So good point on that, Joey. Okay, so shear turbulence, clear air turbulence, we talked about those. Now we can talk about mechanical turbulence or rotor turbulence. Those are a little bit different, but they kind of have a similar principle. So we talked about that kind of mountain wave that Joey talked about earlier with the little whiteboard drawing. Where that air spins is actually called rotor turbulence. And the principle of it is it moves over a mountain, it gets interfered with, and then it tumbles. And we also have things like on the ground, and this is why it's a little bit bumpier when we get down close to landing or right after takeoff. If you're in a place like Minneapolis and there's big hangars and kind of not a lot of terrain in the area to speak of, and that wind can get kicking, and the first thing it runs into is that 40-foot tall hangar. It's got to go up, over, and around that hangar, and then it kind of tumbles to try and get back into its path. Again, I like to use the analogy of, the metaphors of rocks in a river. And it's just like looking at a rock that's sitting in the middle of a river, and the water comes up, it goes over the top, it goes around the sides, it gets all tumbly on the backside. You see that white water. That's how rapids are formed. Now, of course, that's an extreme example, but air behaves in the same way as that liquid does, as that water does, as it moves around. So, as you can imagine, when you're descending into a place like Denver and there's mountains everywhere, really there's mountains on the west side. If you're coming from the west and the air is also coming from the west, as it normally does, you get that turbulence as you are descending in there. So that's why it's really common to see turbulence around there. Same thing with going into a place like Reno, Mammoth, anywhere where the prevailing winds come over mountains before it actually gets to the airport. So that's another time that we would get it. And guess what you would hear? Flight attendants please take your jump seats. You would hear something like that because we're taking an abundance of caution approach to say, hey, let's make sure that everybody's sitting down. Everybody has a seatbelt sign. I'm sorry, everybody has their seatbelts on. And we just get down to this airport safely. So again, we're not going to put anybody in jeopardy as far as like if we think that the turbulence is severe, we're not going to fly into it. But we will fly through turbulence because it doesn't pose a threat to the airplane. So we just make sure, hey, everybody's seated. That's why you're going to hear the flight attendants making so many announcements about it, because 40% of the public is afraid of flying, but 60% is not. And that 60%, sometimes they don't like to listen to that seatbelt sign for whatever reason. So that's why I've been on the back of an airplane and the flight attendants are incessant about making announcements about that seatbelt sign. And I'm like, geez, who is getting up right now? Because Joey, you and I know better than to get up when the seatbelt sign's on. So, the best thing you can do is just respect that thing as a passenger and respect the crew, because we genuinely do want to get everybody up and moving around and maintaining everybody's safety and all those things. So everybody that I fly with takes that very seriously. And Joey, I know we're at different airlines, but I'm sure you guys handle it the exact same way as we do.
Definitely. Yeah, we're it's all out of an abundance of caution. And I'll talk about another one of our turbulence types. This one is going to sound kind of technical at the beginning, but just bear with me. This one is wake turbulence. Okay, so wake turbulence is I'm going to start with an analogy. The bigger the boat through the water, the bigger the wake it's going to throw. And it's very similar with airplanes. The heavier the airplane, the bigger the wake. Where wake turbulence comes from is, again, this is where it's going to sound technical. One of the reasons that we create lift, or one of the ways that we create lift, is with Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli's principle says as something speeds up, the pressure is going to decrease. Okay, so we're not going to get into super technical stuff here, but over the top of the wing, there's a curve which makes the wind over the top of the wing accelerate. This wind is at a lower pressure than the air that's going underneath the wing. So at the end of the wing, there's high pressure on the bottom and low pressure on the top of the wing. That high pressure air is going to try to get up to the low pressure air, and it's going to create a rotor behind the aircraft. The wake turbulence is the worst when you're low, clean, and heavy. And so, again, this is why when you take the runway to line up, and you line up on the runway, and some people are like, well, why did we have to wait on the runway for so long, or 2 minutes or 3 minutes? It's because air traffic control knows the designation of the aircraft that took off before you, and they're going to make sure that you have the separation standards to avoid the wake turbulence. So it'd be like if you're in a little boat and there's a cruise liner coming by, and the cruise liner has a huge wake and you're in the little boat, you're going to wait a little bit and let that cruise ship go by before you go pounding through their wake. It's very similar to aviation, and if you do hit the wake, again, it's a rotor, so it has a lot of swirling tendencies. I know that's not the technical term, but it can be not great for your aircraft, especially if you're in a small aircraft. And this is a very large aircraft, and that's why air traffic control puts these separation standards. So this isn't something that you're going to really ever experience as a passenger, but it is a type of turbulence, and it's a good explanation as to why sometimes you have to wait longer on the runway behind other aircraft, because the air traffic control has separation standards when it comes to wake turbulence.
I think, yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Especially those, we call it heavy, clean, and slow. Those big airplanes, especially during takeoff, when they start to clean up, they're really creating a lot of wake turbulence, because the way a wing works, as Joey alluded to, is there's high pressure on the bottom of the wing and low pressure on the top of the wing. And of course, I drew it the wrong way. So here, I got to edit my drawing real quick, and then we're going to go to the whiteboard. Um, but because of the pressure difference, and this is why wind happens too, the high pressure tries to go to the low pressure, tries to fill that void. So give me 1 second here. All right, so here we go, back to the whiteboard. So when we talk wake turbulence here, we're looking at my beautiful drawing of a wing. And on the top of that wing is that low pressure, because as the air accelerates as it goes over the top, it loses its pressure a little bit. And that's what creates that differential to be able to create lift in the wing. Well, a byproduct of that is that high pressure on the bottom tries to get to the low pressure on the top. So as it does that, it spins. And that spin is called a vortice. or a twisty, whatever you want to call it, but it spins. And so that creates this wake turbulence that we can encounter. And so the air traffic controllers do a really good job. They know exactly how far behind each airplane we need to be and all of those things. So you'll sit there on the runway for 3 minutes, making sure that that wake turbulence has time to dissipate. We know which direction it's moving. So if you're ever a fun example of this actually is if you live in San Diego or you ever go to San Diego, there's that parking garage right underneath the approach to runway 27. Go to the top of that and hang out there for 20 minutes or so. You'll have a bunch of airplanes fly right over the top of you. First of all, it's cool from an av geek perspective, but also it's really cool because you'll feel that wake turbulence come down on top of you. I remember in high school doing this, and I felt one of those vortices come down. I mean, it's loud and it's pretty strong. So it's a really good example to kind of see, oh, hey, this is how airplanes fly. I understand this now, and this is why I need to avoid that wake turbulence. I actually ran into wake turbulence when I was a student. No, I was a private pilot, just learning how to fly, and we were flying from Sacramento down to the Bay Area, and there was a heavy tanker from the military flying in, and we flew underneath his path, and we got caught in the wake turbulence, and it rolled us about 90 degrees. Granted, I was in a little two-seat airplane that barely weighed 1,000 pounds, and so that gets tossed around, like nothing. But in a big airliner, it still can create some turbulence for us. So it's something that we're certainly cognizant of as we move around in the sky. But yeah, that's what wake turbulence is. I'm liking this whiteboard. It's kind of fun for me to go and actually draw stuff up.
I like that a lot. Yeah, there's a nice picture again. I mean, I love it again. Every time you do it, I see meteorologist, but yeah, it's cool. And again, it's not one that you're going to experience a lot. Like we said, heavy, clean, and slow is where it's the worst. As you speed up, they get less. The vortices aren't as large, and so every once in a while you'll be flying through, and it's a clear day, and you're just going to hit like one big jolt, not even a big jolt, but it's gonna feel like you went over a bump in the road. And if you just feel one, if you're ever flying along and it's very smooth, there's nothing, and then all of a sudden you just feel like you hit a speed bump really fast, I guarantee you what it was they flew through somebody else's wake, because there's thousands of aircraft flying up there. Every once in a while you'll just kind of hit one, and it's not aggressive at all. It just feels like you're going over a speed bump at high speed. And so if you ever feel that, you can look to the person sitting next to you and be like, oh yeah, that was somebody's wake, and you'll sound really cool.
There you go. Yeah, I think that's a great tip, Joey. Arming yourself with that knowledge is, of course, important. Okay, wake, shear, rotor. What else? Anything else we're missing?
Frontal turbulence. Usually as you go through a front, you're gonna get some turbulence as well, because again, opposing air masses are meeting, lifting the warm air, and so sometimes you're gonna get some turbulence as a product of that. But more likely, you're gonna get thunderstorms that are around, especially cold fronts moving through an area, pushing the warm air up, and that can be a conversation for another day. But usually with frontal changes, you're going to get a wind change, especially on the ground. You're going to get a wind change. So that could lead into some wind shear, which I know we kind of went through. We were more talking about wind shear up at altitude with the jet stream, but down lower to the ground, you can get sometimes wind shear, wind shear is something that we don't like as pilots. And there's a lot of devices on airports that look for wind shear detection systems. And then also on the aircrafts, we have wind shear detection systems. And then we have wind shear escape maneuvers that we also train, that Kyle's probably been doing for the last month or so. And so we practice wind shear, but we don't fly into known wind shear. It's something that we don't mess with, but there's a lot of detection systems out there that let us know when it's coming so that we don't fly into it. And again, that's just a change in wind velocity, whether it's from a front, or more than likely it's usually because of thunderstorms in the area, and those have gust fronts out the front and out the back. That is usually where wind shear comes, or on really strong wind days. Or again, sometimes the wind is really low at the airport. It's like 10 knots, let's just say. And then as soon as you climb up to 500 feet, it's at 35 knots or whatever. I don't know the exact gradient as to when they would say it's wind shear, but that is wind shear. And sometimes when you go through such dramatic changes in wind, you'll get wind shear. And again, we practice wind shear escape maneuvers all the time. But the point is if it's known wind shear, and microburst alerts are going off, and microbursts are what I was talking about with the thunderstorms. We're going to try to avoid it. We can fly through small wind shear, and sometimes we'll see it posted at an airport. But if it gets severe enough, yeah, we're going to avoid it. And that comes a lot from other aircraft letting us know that they experience wind shear low to the ground. But yeah, I know we talked a little wind shear in the air, but I figured we'd throw out the wind shear that we usually train the most for, or the turbulence that we train the most for. I would say is wind shear. Would you agree with that, Kyle?
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of the one that that has some immediate repercussions for us as far as really what it boils down to. And Joey alluded to this, but when you have a significant and sudden change in the velocity of the wind as we're flying through it, of course, that affects the way that the wing is flying. So when that happens, we just need to change the way that we're flying the airplane and generate more lift over the wing. So that's what we train for when we talk about wind shear escape maneuvers. Joey, as you just said, I just did a bunch of wind shear escape maneuvers, and not only are there devices on the ground that detect it, but there's also devices in the airplane that'll say, caution, wind shear ahead, or go around, wind shear, stuff like that. And actually, if you're boarding the airplane and you're kind of early on, you may hear us going through this. It's called a PWS test, and you'll hear it go through its whole thing. It's quite loud, so it's one of those things that you don't miss it if you're one of the pilots. It displays on your primary flight display, which is one of the digital displays we have in front of us. It'll say in big red letters wind shear, and so we know exactly, hey, okay, wind shear, stow speed brake. We go through our stuff and get out of Dodge. But yeah, so just another thing. I've never hit wind shear in my career as far as having the airplane actually talk to me about it. Have you run into it, Joey?
No, like I said, I've seen it posted at airports, but I've never ever hit it on my own, other than the simulator. And in the simulator, I mean, we do it basically every sim. It seems like during maneuvers training. So, but no, never in real life.
Yeah, yeah, which is good. Obviously, we train for all these
Yeah.
things, and so when we're faced with it in the real world, we're ready to do what we need to do. But it's so exceedingly rare to run into these things, and I think from a nervous flyer perspective, that's something that's really important to understand. Is that these things just we train for them all the time, but they rarely happen. I mean, if we see it once, twice in a career, that's pretty that's a pretty good number, I would say. Joey,
Hmm.
our good buddy Ted has encountered wind shear a few times. He flew up in the Dakotas when he was at SkyWest, so he
Mm.
said that he would run into it all the time up there, kind of during thunderstorm season. So he's got some interesting stories. We'll have to break those out of him, but yeah, okay. So wind shear. What else are we? Thunderstorm, thermal turbulence, all that stuff. And so I'll jump into this one. And if you remember from back in, this has got to be third grade, fourth grade, hot air rises and cool air sinks. So when you were young and you had the upper bunk bed, you remember probably getting a little warm. So it's the same principle with out in the greater environment. So as we transit those areas of hot air rising and cool air sinking, the airplane, of course, has to adjust to that. So it's going to bump along. And when we have an unstable air mass and all of a sudden it's introduced to a lifting mechanism, that's what creates those thunderstorms. And so all of a sudden, the air gets cooled to its dew point and blah, blah, blah. Thunderstorms start popping off. And so the thunderstorms really can only be maybe 10 miles in diameter, something along those lines. But we avoid them at all costs. We do not fly into thunderstorms. We fly around thunderstorms. And we have different measuring kind of criteria that we use, either going over the top of them or when we're going around the side of them. We have onboard weather radar that we can see them day and night. And then, of course, the air traffic controllers on the ground have Doppler radar. And so we can communicate with them too. And you'll hear them say things like, whatever your flight number is, we're showing moderate precipitation, 12 o'clock, 40 miles, advise intentions. And so we can then say, okay, let's look at our radar. Yep. Okay, we do see that. Let's take right 10 degrees on the heading, which just means we're going to turn a little bit off of our course to the right, and we're going to go around that thunderstorm, and then we're going to get back on course. And so we're constantly working with the air traffic controllers, who again are such an amazing resource for us uh, to avoid those areas of thunderstorms. And I was descending into Houston not too long ago, and there were thunderstorms everywhere, it seemed like, and the air traffic controllers were like, "Hey, we got you guys, just follow us, you'll be safe." And so we followed their lead, and we were looking at the radar on our side, and they were telling us, "Okay, in 10 miles we're going to turn you left to this course." And so we were doing that, and we just kind of thread the needle between like four storms. And I was shocked. There was no turbulence at all associated with it. I mean, maybe a
Hmm.
bump here or there, but it was like very, very smooth. We, turned in, came in, landed, taxied to the gate. And yeah, I just continue to be amazed with not only the technology that we have, but also the professionalism of the people that we have the great opportunity to work with, and just how good those controllers are. Because there's 100 of us coming in at any given time, and they took care of us like it was their one job, and I know they do that for everybody. So Joey, I know I speak for both of us when I say that we're very grateful for the resources that we have and those air traffic controllers and their dedication to maintaining both the safety and the comfort, like us, of our flights.
100%. That's very well said. I think the one tip that I'll add in is, and it's not always financially plausible, but the further up in the aircraft you can sit, the less likely you're going to be to experience the worst of the turbulence, if you will. These aircraft have yaw dampers in the back, and this is aerodynamic, but essentially they're gyroscopes that try to keep the tail steady, but sometimes in some aircraft do better jobs than others. If you're in the back of the aircraft, you're going to feel a little bit more of the sway. You're going to feel a little bit more of the bumps, and this kind of has to do with where the center of gravity is on the aircraft. But that's why when Kyle mentioned that the flight attendants in the back are sometimes calling up like, "Hey, you need to turn the seatbelt sign on," because up front in the flight deck, obviously, which is as far forward as you can go, it's usually not as bad as when you sit in the very back of the aircraft. So, again, tip: if you can, the further up you can sit, usually the less you're going to experience the same turbulence. Obviously, the aircraft is all one, but in the back, you might sway a little bit more than sitting up front. But again, rest assured, the aircraft is going to be fine. You just might have to deal with a little bit more of the bumps, if you will.
Yeah, to paraphrase on that, Joey, the only thing I'll add is if you're a sensitive individual to those little tiny movements that you kind of feel maybe more than other folks do, and that makes you feel sick or something like that. Definitely, the closer to the front of the airplane, the better. But also over the middle of the wing, which is still
Mm-hmm.
if you're booking the economy cabin. Then that's a great place to be. It's just right over the middle of that wing because it's kind of the center of it where everything happen. So you're going to feel less of those kind of like small movements. Um, but yeah, good point on bringing that up, Joey. Thanks for doing that. So yeah, I mean, kind of to wrap it up, I think the important thing here is that seatbelt sign is your friend. We're not doing it just to put you in an airplane seat jail by any means. It's certainly to keep you safe and to keep our crew members safe, because that's obviously the number one priority for us is keeping everybody in good shape. So when you get to your destination, it's just right to see the Eiffel Tower or whatever you're doing. So make sure that you pay attention to that. And rest assured, the pilots, they want to find the smooth ride too. The flight attendants, they also want a smooth ride. And I'm as I always say in every one of these episodes, I'm just so grateful for the professional people that we get to work with. And everybody just has this amazing passion for this job, and not even the flying of the airplane, but just the airline industry in general. I mean, we get to run into so many folks that this is really what they kind of live for. And they're so passionate about it. And so it comes across in how they work and how, the dedication that they give to making sure that we're the best airline system in the world is the United States airline system. So, Joey, anything to finish it up with?
Nope. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, as we always say, and again, let us know if there's any topics that you want us to hit. We're going to try to open it up and try to answer everybody's questions if they have any. And I think we're going to probably try to do another Q&A podcast. So please feel free to leave the questions that you have, and we'll try to hit those on a future pod.
Perfect. All right. Well, once again, the From the Flight Deck podcast presented by Dial Pilot. We always thank you for tuning in. It's always a blast for us. And like Joey said, like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends. And we're just grateful to have you giving us a listen, and we're grateful to help you as you navigate overcoming that fear of flying. So once again, thank you. We'll talk to you next week.